The anniversary gala at Forrester Creations was designed to be a night of triumph. A carefully orchestrated celebration meant to remind the world why the Forrester name still carried weight in both fashion and power. The headquarters glowed beneath layers of light and glass, every surface polished until it reflected not only the chandeliers overhead but the confidence of a dynasty that had survived scandals, betrayals, and wars of succession. Designers, investors, family members, and members of the press filled the space with a hum of anticipation. Champagne glasses clinking softly as cameras flashed and reporters murmured about legacy, longevity, and love. This was not merely an event. It was a statement that Forrester Creations remained unshaken, unified, and untouchable. At the center of it all stood Brooke Logan, radiant and composed as she stepped onto the podium. Years of scrutiny had taught her how to hold herself under lights like these. How to smile with warmth even when nerves fluttered beneath the surface. She looked out at the crowd, at faces both familiar and critical, and allowed herself a brief moment of pride. This company had been her home, her battlefield, and her redemption. She spoke of love first. Not contracts or profits, but love as the foundation of everything they had built. Love for design, love for family, love for the man who had stood beside her through storms too numerous to count. Ridge Forrester. Her voice wavered only slightly as she spoke his name, emotion threading through her words as she acknowledged the complicated history they shared and the resilience that had carried them forward despite everything that had tried to tear them apart. The room leaned in, captivated. Brooke spoke of legacy not as something inherited, but as something earned through sacrifice and belief, her words resonating with a sincerity that felt almost intimate despite the grandeur of the setting. She praised the Forrester family, thanked Eric Forrester for his vision, acknowledged the next generation with pride and hope, and framed the company's future as a shared dream rather than a contested prize. Applause swelled as she reached the emotional peak of her speech, her eyes shining as she spoke of trust, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds that defined both her personal life and her professional one. That was when the first flicker appeared. At first, it was subtle enough to be mistaken for a technical glitch, a brief ripple across the massive screen behind her that drew only a few puzzled glances. Brooke continued speaking, unaware, her voice steady as she thanked their partners and supporters. Then the flicker intensified, the image behind her stuttering and distorting, until suddenly her carefully prepared presentation vanished altogether. In its place appeared an unfamiliar email interface, stark and intrusive, its cold digital lines cutting violently through the warmth of the room. A hush fell over the audience as the content of the email resolved into sharp focus. Projected larger than life for everyone to see was a series of documents, transaction records, and account details laid out with brutal clarity. The message was anonymous, unsigned, and devastating. It alleged that Brooke Logan had secretly purchased significant shares of Forrester Creations through offshore accounts, using foreign intermediaries to conceal her identity, with the apparent intent of executing a covert takeover. Numbers scrolled across the screen, dates highlighted in red, arrows pointing to shell corporations and foreign banks. The implication was unmistakable, and the timing could not have been more calculated. Shock rippled through the room like a physical force. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Cameras pivoted instinctively toward Brooke, then toward Ridge, whose face drained of color as he stared at the screen. For a heartbeat, he seemed unable to process what he was seeing, as if his mind rejected the possibility outright. Then disbelief gave way to something darker, something sharper, and his expression hardened into a mask of betrayal so raw it made even seasoned reporters hesitate. Ridge turned to Brooke slowly, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the projector. When he spoke, his voice cut through the room like a blade, low and furious, demanding answers that felt more like accusations. He questioned her loyalty, her honesty, the very foundation of the love she had just publicly declared. Each word carried the weight of decades of shared history, of fights forgiven and wounds reopened. And now, in his eyes, all of it seemed to collapse into this single moment of perceived treachery. Brooke's world tilted violently. She spun toward the screen, her breath catching as she took in the evidence laid bare for all to see. Her mind raced, scrambling to make sense of what she was seeing, to find some explanation that did not involve the complete destruction of everything she held dear. She turned back to Ridge, panic flashing across her face as she denied the allegations with desperate urgency. She insisted that she had never made such purchases, that the accounts were not hers, that this was an elaborate setup orchestrated by an enemy who had waited for the perfect moment to strike. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not with guilt, but with the terror of realizing how convincing the lie looked. But denial struggled to find traction in a room already primed for judgment. Steffi Forrester stepped forward, her anger unmistakable as she confronted Brooke with pointed questions about intent and transparency. To Steffi, the betrayal felt deeply personal, another chapter in a long history of mistrust that had never fully healed. Thomas Forrester joined her, his expression cold and calculating as he demanded clarity, his loyalty to the Forrester name outweighing any residual sympathy he might have once held for Brooke. Even Eric, usually measured and reflective, could not hide his disappointment as he questioned how such transactions could exist without Brooke's knowledge if she were truly innocent. Around them, whispers erupted into a roar. The media wasted no time. Reporters typing furiously, live feeds lighting up with headlines that framed the story as a shocking fall from grace. The narrative wrote itself with brutal efficiency. Brooke Logan, longtime face of integrity and passion at Forrester Creations, exposed as a would-be usurper. A woman willing to undermine the very family she claimed to love. Social media exploded, speculation multiplying faster than facts. Every past conflict reinterpreted as foreshadowing. The carefully curated image of Brooke as a fashion icon and romantic heroine shattered in real time, replaced by suspicion and scorn. Brooke tried to speak again, to cut through the noise, but her words dissolved into the chaos. Ridge had turned away from her now, his posture rigid, his refusal to meet her eyes more devastating than any shouted accusation. She reached out instinctively, only to stop herself, realizing too late that the physical distance between them mirrored an emotional chasm that had opened beneath her feet. One by one, people she had considered allies stepped back, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation, unwilling to be associated with a scandal still unfolding. As security scrambled to shut down the projection and regain control of the event, it was already too late. The damage was irreversible. Brooke stood frozen at the podium, lights glaring down on her like an interrogation lamp. The applause from moments earlier replaced by a sea of turned backs and averted gazes. She had never felt so exposed, so profoundly alone, even in a room full of people. The weight of isolation pressed down on her, heavier than any accusation, as she realized that innocence alone might not be enough to save her now. In the aftermath, as the gala dissolved into disarray and guests were ushered out amid flashing cameras and shouted questions, Brooke remained behind, standing amid the wreckage of her own life. The stage where she had spoken of love and legacy felt like a cruel mockery now. Its symbolism inverted. She understood with chilling clarity that whoever had orchestrated this reveal had not merely wanted to embarrass her, they had wanted to sever her from her family, to pit Ridge against her in the most public and irreversible way possible. Somewhere behind the scenes, a hidden adversary had succeeded beyond expectation. Brooke Logan, once surrounded by admiration and trust, now faced the collapse of both her career and her family in a single devastating blow. And as the lights dimmed on Forrester Creations that night, one truth echoed louder than any headline. This was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a reckoning that would force every Forrester to choose between blood, truth, and the fragile remains of love. In the stunned silence that followed the gala's abrupt collapse, the corridors of Forrester Creations seemed to narrow, as if the building itself were closing ranks around the scandal now branded into its walls. The crowd dispersed under the watchful eyes of security and the hungry lenses of cameras. But the damage refused to leave with them. It lingered in the air, in the sharp scent of adrenaline and cold fear, in the way conversations fell into whispers and then into nothing at all. Brooke remained rooted where she stood long after the last reporter had been escorted out, her heels planted on the polished floor as if moving would confirm the reality she was still struggling to comprehend. The speech she had prepared, carefully crafted words about love, loyalty, and legacy, echoed in her mind like a cruel parody, each sentence now weaponized against her. Ridge retreated into one of the glass-walled conference rooms overlooking the main floor, his reflection multiplying across the panels as he paced. Every step felt like an attempt to outrun the image burned into his mind. Those transaction records, the offshore accounts, the deliberate precision of the accusations. He wanted to believe Brooke's denial, to cling to the decades of intimacy and shared survival that had defined them. But the betrayal felt visceral, immediate, and public in a way that left little room for doubt. The humiliation stung almost as sharply as the fear, because whatever the truth might be, the world now believed a narrative in which he was the last to know. He pressed his hands against the glass, staring down at the empty space below, wondering when love had become indistinguishable from risk. In a smaller office down the hall, Steffi Forrester gathered Thomas Forrester and Eric Forrester around a table strewn with hastily printed screenshots. Their anger was not theatrical. It was focused. sharpened by years of defending the family against external threats. Steffi's voice was tight as she outlined the implications. The legal exposure, the potential for shareholders to panic and rivals to exploit the chaos. Thomas listened with a furrowed brow, already mapping countermeasures in his head, while Eric's disappointment settled into a weary resolve. He had seen crises before, had watched empires wobble and recover, but never had the blow come from someone so deeply entwined with the company's soul. He did not speak immediately, choosing instead to study the documents, his silence carrying more weight than any accusation. Brooke wandered into the design studio alone, the vast room dim now that the event lights had been shut off. Mannequins stood frozen in half-finished gowns, sequins catching the ambient glow like distant stars. This had always been her refuge, the place where creation soothed chaos, where fabric and vision could still make sense when emotions did not. She sank onto a stool, her hands trembling as she replayed the moment the screen had changed. The way the room had turned on her in an instant. Her mind raced through possibilities, enemies she had made, grudges she had underestimated. She knew enough about corporate warfare to recognize a perfectly timed ambush when she saw one. And the precision of it terrified her. Whoever had done this had not simply wanted to accuse her, they had wanted to isolate her completely. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages she could not yet bear to read. Lawyers, friends, reporters, all demanding answers she did not have. One name, however, cut through the noise when it appeared on her screen: Hope Logan. Hope's voice, when Brooke finally answered, was shaken but steady, offering reassurance without judgment. She promised to help, to stand by her mother no matter what the headlines said. The sound of that unconditional support broke something open in Brooke, tears finally spilling as she clung to the one certainty she had left. Even as the world questioned her integrity, Hope's faith reminded her that she was not entirely alone. Back in the conference room, Ridge was joined by Steffi and Eric, the tension thick enough to taste. Steffi spoke first, urging immediate action, suspending Brooke's access, issuing a statement, protecting the company before the story spiraled further out of control. Ridge bristled at the suggestion, torn between his role as CEO and his role as Brooke's partner. Eric intervened gently but firmly, reminding them both that leadership demanded clarity, not emotion. He proposed an internal investigation, independent and transparent, a way to uncover the truth without sacrificing due process. The suggestion landed heavily, because it implied something none of them wanted to say aloud, that Brooke might indeed be guilty, or at least entangled in something far more complex than she realized. As night fell, social media erupted with speculation. Old interviews resurfaced, past conflicts reinterpreted as evidence, every moment of ambition reframed as motive. The narrative hardened quickly, and Brooke's public image fractured under the weight of it. Commentators spoke of betrayal and calculated deception, of a woman who had always wanted more than she admitted. Watching the coverage from her darkened living room later that night, Brooke felt as though she were observing someone else's life implode. She recognized none of the villainous certainty in those portrayals, yet she understood how easily perception could become reality when enough voices repeated the same accusation. Determined not to surrender to despair, Brooke reached out to a forensic accountant recommended by a trusted contact, initiating her own investigation parallel to the company's. If someone had used her name, her reputation, to move money through offshore channels, she would find out how. The process was daunting, the implications frightening, but action steadied her where shock had paralyzed her. Each step she took was an act of defiance against the narrative that painted her as powerless or corrupt. Meanwhile, Ridge faced a reckoning of his own. Alone in his office late into the night, he sifted through memories of Brooke's past choices, moments of honesty and deception alike, trying to discern whether this betrayal fit the woman he loved. Doubt gnawed at him, eroding the certainty he had always relied on. He hated the position he was in, forced to choose between belief and responsibility, between the heart and the company his family had built. The image of Brooke standing alone on that stage haunted him, but so did the cold logic of the evidence. By morning, the Forrester family was divided not by shouting but by silence. Lines had been drawn, not yet spoken but keenly felt, as each person braced for what the investigation might reveal. Brooke prepared to fight not just for her innocence, but for her place in a family that now viewed her through the lens of suspicion. And somewhere, unseen and unnamed, the architect of the scandal watched the fallout unfold, their plan advancing exactly as intended, knowing that the next revelation, whatever it might be, would cut even deeper. The collapse at Forrester Creations had set something irreversible in motion. Trust, once fractured, would not be easily restored, and love, once doubted, would demand proof few could provide. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, one truth settled heavily over everyone involved. The anniversary meant to celebrate unity had instead exposed the fault lines beneath the empire. And the battle to reclaim the truth would exact a price far greater than anyone was prepared to pay.